Hello everyone. Before we start, make sure to like and subscribe to the channel and leave a comment with where you're from and what time you're watching. That way, YouTube will keep showing you stories just like this one. It began with a whisper, the kind that slips between people in half-lit rooms, passed along with the weight of something too dangerous to say aloud. In a forgotten corner of rural America, there's a story the old-timers still tell. Never all at once, never with every detail. It's about a woman named Mary Ellen Walker, and the winter she carried a child the world was never supposed to meet. Mary Ellen lived her entire life on the same patch of Appalachian land where her grandfather had built a cabin in the 1890s. The Walker bloodline had been rooted in those hills for as long as anyone could remember. Some say too long. Families there married closer than the law would allow, and though no one in town ever admitted it outright, they all knew the Walkers were different. By the time Mary Ellen was in her late 40s, her world had narrowed to a single companion, her son, Thomas. A quiet man in his 20s, Thomas never worked in town, never dated, and was rarely seen apart from his mother. They moved like a pair that had long since learned to depend on no one else. In the summer of 1982, the change in Mary Ellen became impossible to ignore. The curve of her belly swelled under faded dresses. She sat on the porch in the evenings, one hand resting over her stomach, the other holding a cigarette, her gaze fixed on the dirt road like she was waiting for someone who would never come. Neighbors began to talk, quietly at first, then with open disgust. They whispered about how Thomas had never looked at another woman, about the way he and his mother spoke to each other in tones too soft, too intimate, and about how the Walkers had always been close. What grew inside her was more than a scandal. It was a continuation of a bloodline that had already bent too far inward, and the kind of secret that can warp a family and a town forever. The photo was grainy, overexposed by the summer sun, but the details still cut through time like a rusted blade. Her face was weathered, not just by age but by something heavier, the kind of weight that bends a person's spine long before their body grows old. Thomas stood behind her in that image, one hand resting on her shoulder, not possessive, not protective, something else entirely. Something that made even the local pastor refuse to keep the picture on his wall of historical residents. The story of how things came to this wasn't told in a straight line. People who remembered Mary Ellen's younger days spoke of isolation. She was kept home from school after the 4th grade to help around the house, though most suspected the real reason was to keep her away from outsiders. The family's land stretched deep into the hills, far from paved roads, and her father, a man whose name appears in no census after 1940, was known for locking the gate at night. Her mother, quiet and thin, never spoke above a whisper in public. When she died suddenly in the winter of 1947, Mary Ellen was only 13. She didn't cry at the funeral, she didn't even look at the coffin. That same year, her father withdrew completely, and the few visitors who came up the drive noticed that Mary Ellen was now the one cooking his meals, mending his shirts, and sitting beside him on the porch long into the night. When her father passed away a decade later, the land and the house went to her, but the strange solitude remained. It was only when Thomas was born in the early 1950s that the whispers began again. No one could name the father. No man claimed him, and though birth certificates were technically required by then, Mary Ellen's boy seemed to slip into existence without a paper trail, as if he'd simply appeared in that crumbling house one winter morning. By the time Thomas was grown, the same patterns had begun to repeat. He didn't date. He didn't work in town. He stayed close to his mother, closer than a son should, and when the pregnancy became obvious, the few neighbors who dared to talk about it said the look in his eyes wasn't guilt, but something worse. The kind of look that said this was no accident at all. The pregnancy carried on in silence. No prenatal visits, no ultrasound, no chatter about baby names or due dates. The only signs were the swelling of her belly and the increasing scarcity of her appearances outside the property. By autumn, Mary Ellen's windows were shuttered most days, and at night the only light came from a single oil lamp in the kitchen, its glow faint and flickering against the peeling wallpaper. But the hills remember. Old stories seep into the soil, and the people who've lived there long enough can tell when history is repeating itself. There was an unspoken understanding in the county that Mary Ellen's family had been closed for generations, that cousins had wed cousins, that aunts had become more than aunts. The bloodline twisted inward like the gnarled roots of the mountain oaks, feeding on itself until no branch grew straight. One man, a retired mail carrier named Henry Crow, claimed he had seen something he'd never forget. He'd been delivering to the property since Mary Ellen's father was alive, and in the late months of her pregnancy, he once caught sight through a cracked curtain. Inside, Thomas was seated at the table, hands folded, staring at his mother as she stood over the stove. But it wasn't the scene itself that haunted him. It was the way she turned her head toward Thomas when she noticed Henry's shadow at the window, not startled, not ashamed, but with a faint, almost defiant smirk, like she knew there was nothing anyone could do. Henry told that story only once, many years later, and refused to give details about the expression on Thomas's face. He would only say that it was the kind of look you don't forget, even if you want to. The few townsfolk who dared speak of it often compared Mary Ellen's house to a kind of private kingdom, one where rules were made and enforced within the family alone, and the outside world was nothing more than background noise. Some suspected the pregnancy was a result of years of grooming. Others believed it was a calculated choice, a deliberate act to keep the blood pure, as the older generation of her family might have called it. The truth, however, was something no one could confirm, because those who might have known kept their silence until the day they died. And the silence in those hills is louder than any confession. When winter came, it wrapped the hills in a stillness that made every sound carry farther. The crunch of boots on frosted dirt, the slam of a screen door, even the faint crying of an infant, all of it traveled through the cold air like secrets desperate to be heard. No one saw the birth. There was no ambulance, no midwife, no trip to the county hospital. But one night in late January of 1983, a neighbor swore they heard it. A thin, high-pitched wail carried on the wind. The sound lasted less than a minute before being swallowed by the dark. By morning, there was no sign of anything at the house except a trail of ashes from the wood stove drifting out of the chimney. People began watching more closely after that. And though Mary Ellen appeared outside occasionally, tending to the woodpile, walking down the lane to fetch water, the child was never seen, not once. Thomas was the same, pale, withdrawn, moving with the slow, deliberate motions of someone guarding a fragile secret. Speculation ran wild. Some believed the child had been stillborn. Others said it had been taken away by distant relatives who wanted to spare it from the curse of its own lineage. But the darkest whispers suggested something else, that Mary Ellen and Thomas had decided the child would never live long enough for the world to know it existed. The county records from that year offer no answers, no birth certificate, no baptism, not even a death notice, just a void where a life should have been. And in small towns, a void is never empty. It fills with imagination, suspicion, and fear. The few outsiders who tried to ask questions didn't get far. One reporter from a small regional paper visited the property in the spring, claiming he was doing a human interest piece on life in the Appalachian backwoods. He returned to town pale and tight-lipped, refusing to share what he'd seen. He never wrote the article. What happened in that house during those months after the birth is something only two people knew for certain, and both carried it with them to their graves. The only thing the rest of the county was sure of was that, after the winter of '83, Mary Ellen and Thomas seemed different. Not broken, not grieving, but bound together in a way that made even the boldest gossip fall silent. By the summer of 1983, the change in them was undeniable. Thomas no longer avoided the eyes of strangers. Instead, he met them with a cold, measured stare that seemed to challenge anyone to speak. Mary Ellen, for her part, appeared more at ease than she had in years, as though some heavy burden had been resolved, though no one could agree on what that resolution had been. If you're still watching, you're already braver than most. Tell us in the comments, What would you have done if this was your bloodline? The strange thing about small communities is that over time horror becomes part of the landscape. The human mind adjusts. People who had once whispered in disgust began to say less and less. Eventually their silence was not just fear, it was acceptance. And in that acceptance, the past began to blur. Details slipped away. Names became harder to recall. The story was still there, but like a ghost that visits only in dreams. Yet a few fragments survived. An old grocery store ledger from the mid-80s shows Thomas buying large amounts of canned goods, powdered milk, and, strangely, sewing supplies. Not the kind you'd expect for mending clothes, but heavy twine, thick needles, and fabric bolts. There's no way to know what those were for, but it's telling that during those same months, the windows of Mary Ellen's house were covered from the inside with nailed-up sheets. Visitors dwindled to none. The mailman began leaving letters in a box at the gate rather than walking the long gravel drive, and those who passed by at night reported seeing shadows moving behind the curtained windows, sometimes 2 figures, sometimes 3, though no one could say for sure. In late 1984, Mary Ellen's last surviving cousin, a woman in her 60s who lived 2 counties over, came to visit. She stayed for just over an hour. When she left, her face was pale, her hands shaking so badly she dropped her car keys twice. She never returned, and when asked about the visit years later, she simply said, "Some things should stay where they are." By the end of the decade, whatever was happening in that house had stopped attracting attention, not because the questions were answered, but because the people who might have asked them didn't want to know anymore. Time, as it always does, began to sand down the sharper edges of the story. By the early 1990s, the house was just another weather-beaten structure sinking into the earth. The paint peeled in long, curling strips. The porch sagged, the roofline bent as if bowing under the weight of the years. And inside, Mary Ellen and Thomas seemed to fade into the shadows, seen only in glimpses, at the post office, at the feed store, driving the same rusted truck they'd had for decades. But the strange thing about the past is that it refuses to stay buried. In 1995, a hunter from out of state got lost in the hills and stumbled upon a half-collapsed storage shed behind Mary Ellen's property. Inside, under a tarp, he claimed he found a small wooden cradle, hand-carved but cracked from years of damp. Beside it lay a bundle of cloth, stiff with age and darkened by mold. He didn't open it, or so he said, but he left the shed feeling sick to his stomach, swearing he'd heard the faint sound of crying in the trees as he walked away. When word of this reached town, the old rumors sparked back to life. The cradle, the bundle, the winter of '83. It was as if the story had been waiting in the dark for someone to stir it awake. Mary Ellen denied everything, of course. When asked about the cradle, she said it belonged to her mother, a relic from her own childhood. As for the bundle, she claimed it was just rags. But her eyes, those eyes in the faded photographs, told a different story. By 1998, Mary Ellen was in her mid-60s, Thomas in his 40s. They were still inseparable, still living under the same sagging roof. When neighbors spoke of them now, it was without judgment. Instead, there was a kind of weary resignation, as though the two of them had become part of the hills themselves, fixed, unchanging, beyond the reach of law or morality. The truth about the child, about what happened after that winter, was no closer to being known. The only certainty was that whatever took place inside those walls had marked them both forever. And even if every witness to their lives were gone, the story would remain, whispered into the ears of those willing to listen, and brave enough to believe. Mary Ellen died quietly in the spring of 2001. No funeral was held, no obituary ran in the paper. Her death certificate was filed by the county clerk without ceremony, just another piece of paperwork in a stack of hundreds. She was buried in a small, unmarked grave at the edge of the family property, the spot chosen by Thomas himself. After her passing, Thomas remained in the house alone. The years that followed were marked by a steady unraveling. The roof caved in over the kitchen, vines swallowed the porch, and the once tended garden became a tangle of weeds. Neighbors said he spoke even less than before, sometimes going months without being seen at all. When he did appear in town, his hair was wild, his clothes worn thin, and his eyes, those same cold, unblinking eyes, seemed fixed somewhere far away. It wasn't until Thomas's death in 2011 that the house was finally opened. The county sent in a cleanup crew to clear the debris before putting the land up for auction. They found the rooms exactly as they had been decades earlier, dishes still in the sink, blankets folded neatly on the bed, jars of preserved vegetables stacked in the pantry. But in the back bedroom, the one with the nailed-up sheets still clinging to the window frame, they discovered something else. A small wooden box sat on the floor, its lid carved with a pattern of interlocking circles. Inside was a single baby's bonnet, yellowed with age, and a folded slip of paper. The paper contained only 4 words, written in shaky, uneven handwriting: "Our blood, our own." No one could prove what it meant. The county auctioned the land to a developer, the house was torn down, and the ground where it stood is now just another patch of overgrown earth. But for those who remember the winter of '83 and the woman whose life was shaped by shadows, the demolition didn't erase anything. If anything, it made the story stronger, because now the only place it exists is in the telling, passed along in low voices, shared with strangers who wander too far into the hills. The facts may never be confirmed, the truth never officially known. But in that part of the world, when the wind moves through the trees at night, some swear they still hear it, the faint cry of a child who should never have been born, and the quiet voice of a mother who refused to let go.